Okay, about a year ago, David, Hernandez, and I, and some other really good folks were up here at the first conference, and we were the wet blanket, Debbie Downers, hey, that's all great, you're going to get that certified, but it ain't going to happen, right? Because our response was the regulators are going to pay attention to this, and you're all focused on aircraft certification. There's a lot of other stuff going on, and it's just not going to happen that fast. So now a year later, we're here to we're trying not to be the Debbie Downers, but perhaps plant some seeds for the types of issues that you, as the designers, builders, financiers, operators of these new technologies, need to keep in mind to add to your very long already to-do list on how to make this happen. And the focus is on the operational side of that. Consider, and you can get it certified by the FAA. You got a vehicle that now works. We've heard some really cool stuff on air traffic control, and we're going to get that deconflicted. And then you put down your business plan, and the regulators say, that's great, but what you're doing is illegal because it doesn't match the operational rules that are in place. And when I'm saying operational rules, what I'm talking about is the question of who can carry how many people, maybe for some type of profit, and what do they have to do, what do they have to interface with on to make that happen. It's the talking to the FISD on an ongoing basis, not the certifier or tower when you want to go take off. So it's that focus. Now, I will say a year ago, as this all started, there was very little on this topic, and a couple of us kept saying, yeah, but you got to operate. And I'm really very heartened to see that that has clearly become more of a topic today, because that's already been talked about and touched on. So this is really more of a little bit of a deeper dive on some of those issues that you all want to keep in the back of your mind. And really the questions are, as you are building up these technologies and these business plans, are you taking into account these operational rules? Are you going to have the ability to perhaps change some of the rules based on increased technologies and in safety? And what's the best way to do that? How best to interface with the regulators? So I've just told you what we're going to tell you. My name is David Norton. I am a partner at Shackelford, Bowen, McKinley, Norton. I'm the head of the aviation practice there in Dallas. I started out actually as an Air Force pilot. I went to law school, got an MBA and all that stuff about 25 years ago. And my practice is all focused around business aviation. Most of my days are help people addressing these operational rules. Are they Part 91 or are they 135 and so forth? I've had the chance over the years to work with some really amazing folks. Alphabetical org at NATA, I know Gary Dempsey, Tim Obitz are here, NBAA, Mike Nichols is here. There's a lot of the organizations that have really put this in the forefront and laid a lot of the groundwork for this particular topic. The Uber Air conferences are awesome. And now, Revolution.Aero, which I just think is awesome. In fact, I and my partners, David Mayer and Greg Reigel, were so happy that we were happy to talk our firm into being a sponsor, and I'm totally honored to be here and to be able to participate in this panel. So that being said, I'm not even by far I'm like the least amazing person on the stage. I'm going to tell you very quickly about the other people that are eminently qualified to discuss this, and I'm just going to go in alphabetical order. So we've got Carl Dietrich. Carl was the founder of Terrafugia and led the company's growth through and beyond acquisition by the Geely Holding Group. Earlier this year, he left Terrafugia to create Jump Aero, an early-stage venture that is currently in stealth. He currently serves as the chairman of the General Aviation Manufacturers Association Simplified Vehicle Operations Subcommittee. That's Carl. We have Patrick Hansen. Patrick holds a commercial engineering degree from HEC in Brussels and an MBA in finance from McGill University in Montreal. He started his career in financing and banking in London and Moscow and successfully created several companies. He founded Luxaviation in 2008 and serves as its CEO. Luxaviation operates one of the largest fleet of VIP jets and helicopters in the world and has 16 air operator certificates. That's amazing. Which leads them to work a lot with all of the different regulatory agencies on these very issues that we're talking about. Luxaviation also has drone operations and is one of the first companies operating drones under the new European Commission set of rules. David Hernandez, fellow Air Force Academy grad with me, although it's a couple years behind me, but I won't hold that against him. He's actually a shareholder at Vedder Price, based in DC. He's a member of their Global Transportation Finance Practice Group and is a former USDT honors attorney and an FAA regulatory and enforcement attorney. Over 23 years, David's handled a wide variety of aviation-related corporate and regulatory matters, most recently assisting one of the nation's largest public utilities successfully integrating drones into their power line inspection protocols, and a major university incorporating drones into the university's Department of engineering. David's a very well-recognized expert in this area across the country. He currently advises clients on how to navigate the FAA's regulatory exemption waiver process and advises clients on the regulatory hurdles associated with business models. So he and I do a lot of the same stuff. We're kind of friendly, very friendly competitors. We have Mike Nichols, Senior VP with the National Business Aviation Association. And he leads the new strategy and innovation division and is focused on creating a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship with the NBAA team that's developing new programs, products, and services to benefit NBAA and helping to integrate new technologies into business aviation industry, including urban air mobility. He's also an active private pilot and a proud owner of a Grumman Tiger airplane, which he put in parentheses, and I'm going to take credit for this. And his awesome aviation attorney helped make that acquisition a very seamless process.
David was my aviation lawyer.
And then last but definitely not least is Michael Whitaker. Mike spent his career in aviation, 20 years as an airline executive, and the most relevant for today's discussion, and I'm really glad you're here. Mike was the #2 at the FAA during the Obama administration from 2013 to 2016. And he was there when the early small UAS rules were put into place, and the FAA set up the new division just to deal with drones. He's a pilot, now consults with airlines, drone companies, and venture funds investing in this space. So we have this amazing panel, a great cross-section of really fascinating background on the policy issues that we want to talk about. So today, this is really, it's already been touched on, but it's going to be a little bit deeper dive into the concepts of what are the operational rules and regulations and concepts and policies that the industry is going to have to face as it develops. So I'm going to ask for the first slide. We're going to do 3 polling questions, and because I was such an awesome teacher, I've already told you the answers to these 3 questions. So we'll see if, no, that's not the question. I don't know if do you have my questions tied up? It should be, so the question should be, here's the question that I thought I'd sent. In the U.S., the Federal Aviation Administration is the only federal level agency that will have anything to say about the aviation component of urban air mobility. Is that true or false? Is it just the FAA? I guess we won't do the thing. But the answer is no. Obviously, as we already said, there's a lot of different agencies that are going to have some say about how these technologies are operated, right? I think one useful way to do an analysis of that is to break into 3 buckets. And I would say the first one is the first one we're going to talk about is an economic bucket. And we're not going to focus on this so much because I really want to focus on the operational side, but you got to recognize that there are other agencies that are going to have something to say. And I want to tell you, I have directed some questions to individuals, but I want all of the panel to kind of jump in and offer their thoughts where pertinent on this. So the first question I did, a year ago, David, you and I talked about kind of the DOT side, and can you give a 30-second overview of what that issue was and what the status of that is?
Yeah. So, we on?
Yep.
So the DOT, can you? Okay. So the Department of Transportation, their primary focus is economic authority. And just like we've been talking about today, and I think previous panels have really addressed it very well, they're making a lot of progress across the board, but there are a couple agencies or just areas that are maybe haven't really addressed it. I think one that you just mentioned previously, one of the big ones I think is the FCC. How are these things going to operate? What radio frequencies? That's a big thing. When you put 1 million or so or 2 million things into the sky, what's going to happen there? With respect to DOT, it's economic authority. What type of economic authority? Are these going to be brokery type things where you're going to have to do disclosures? What type of disclosures? All of this stuff's going to happen sooner or later. But I think that the DOT and, I don't think anybody's talking about it right now, at least at that agency or with respect to that type of regulatory hurdle.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's kind of interesting because really, if you're doing any kind of per seat sale basis, generally speaking, you need economic authority, and that just hasn't really come up. I'm going to look at Patrick because I'm going to keep going back to you over the course of this, and we're asking questions, and I really want to hear your perspective more from the EU or the European level on what are the other agency type things other than operational that you're seeing that you think will have an impact.
Well, I think the European Union is slightly in a different situation right now than the FAA. I think today there's no eVTOL operation actually commercially in the air. I would like, because I'm coming from the operational side, I would like just maybe to link up on some of the discussions that went before on, I think in the morning and also in the afternoon with Uber. I think Uber mentioned very correctly, it is extremely complex, or they said it's very tough to fly a helicopter from New York to, from Manhattan to the airport. And I think this morning somebody, someone else mentioned that it is just by pushing 2 or 3 buttons, all of this is getting solved. I think what operators around the world are doing is an extremely complex task. And if Uber thinks it is tough to fly a helicopter from Manhattan to JFK, they should try to fly a G650 from LA to Beijing. That is what is really tough, and I think that is ultimately what operators are dealing with, and I think that is what the people in the room should also understand. Operations is about safety, it's about compliance, and that is what the Europeans, as well as I think the FAA, is constantly trying to improve and make sure that it happens.
Okay, very good, thank you. Anybody else on just the economic side of stuff, or anywhere you want to add anything, or should I keep going? Let's keep going. Okay, so the second, hey, we got the Slido thing. So the next question was, in the U.S., the Federal Aviation, here we go. Within the FAA, the focus on getting aircraft into the air will be on certification of new aircraft being designed specifically for urban air mobility. In other words, that's the only focus. True or false? And come on, I already told you the answer. Nobody's even going to vote. Oh, there we go. Although that is a major component, the focus, that's not the only focus. And that's really the focus of this presentation.
Let me add to that, though.
Yes,
I think
please do.
The previous panel, or one of the previous panels. So the FAA is a safety agency, right? I mean, that's the primary thing to be concerned about. And so all of this discussion we're having is focused on safety, at least from an FAA perspective. So none of this is going to happen unless it's going to be safe. And I think that, a lot of people get frustrated by when they hear safety, they think it's going to slow down the process and stuff like that. But whenever you deal with the FAA, you're going to have to deal with safety, and it's going to be a slow process. It's going to be methodical, and they're not in the business to help us in terms of making profit. They want to make things safe. They don't want to make profits, and so that's their primary concern. But they'll certainly help. Well,
so let me jump in because I was going to make the same point. And that's a really good point. If we have 3 buckets going, there's an economic bucket, this is on the technical certification bucket, and then we're going to get to the operational side. But one of your points is really good, and I want to hear Whitaker's thought on this, is a lot of people think when you talk to a person at the FAA, you've talked to the entire FAA. What the airplane certification people are doing is different than what the FSDO is doing, is different than what ATC is doing. Sometimes I don't think they even realize that it's part of the same agency, and what headquarters is doing is very different than what the local FSDO is doing, which is different from the CMO. So within the certification branch, and with those comments in mind, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, there's 200 companies, there's, what is the status of certification? How do you see that playing out from what you've been working on?
Well, I think we saw this throughout the morning. You have a sort of a clash of cultures. You have the Silicon Valley fail-fast mentality meeting the FAA safety-first mentality. So it's sort of an unstoppable force hitting an immovable object, and we're not sure how that's going to come out. But if you ask Silicon Valley how long until we have drones covering the skies, you'll hear 18 months. If you ask FAA, they'll say 12 years. And NASA sort of proudly comes in and says, no, we think it's going to be 8.5 and takes the middle ground. The system is not set up for this. It's not. It's set up for Boeing and Cessna. You get your aircraft, you get your 172 certified in 1956, and you make it for the next 60 years. Or you get your 737 certified in 1965, and you make it, forever. In the current environment, by the time you get something certificated, it's likely to be obsolete. So I think you've got, as those 200, and as someone said, it might be 300 by the time we're done, companies going to the FAA, they don't have a system or capacity to to really process those in a meaningful way. So it's going to be a little bit of a crisis, I think.
Okay. Well, I'd love to hear really both Carl's perspective and Mike Nichols' perspective from where you're coming from on just the certification side. What's your sense in the industry?
Sure, yeah. The General Aviation Manufacturers Association has been really trying to champion the use of the new Part 23 as a major part of the certification basis for a lot of these new eVTOLs, along with some sections of Part 27 and hopefully a minimum number of special conditions. And that really is key, because with the rewrite of Part 23, there is this flexibility, this ability to use industry standards, which can potentially evolve much faster than a rulemaking process or something like that might take 5 years, 10 years, something like that. So that positioning of the new Part 23 relying on ASTM standards or industry standards in general as a means of compliance to the rule is really key to enabling what hopefully will be a not too delayed certification process for many of these eVTOLs coming into the space right now. It's also key, just to the point here, that certification is not the only problem, and the association is very interested in working with folks inside the Flight Standards Organization to try to lay the groundwork for how we will enable what we're calling simplified vehicle operation, or licensing of vehicles that may be capable of vertical takeoff and landing that don't have a traditional cyclic and collective, which most of these vehicles don't have. So there are some new operational paradigms that we are, I would say, at the earliest stages of discussing with the relevant authorities.
Actually, we're going to come back to that too, so that's a really good point. So Mike, do you want to?
Yeah. So I'm not a Debbie Downer on this at all. So, from my viewpoint, there are some incredibly brilliant people working on this. There's a lot of money pouring into urban air mobility, into eVTOL, into this entire ecosystem. And what I think is really cool about that is if you can address things like acoustics and battery technology and weight and aircraft performance and build out vertiports and the entire infrastructure, UTM, the operating side is going to be the easy side. The FAA Part 135 regulations can be modified. We can do things through exemption. But I think that's going to be a lot easier than everything else. And I'm 100% confident that the everything else is going to happen, and probably a lot faster than what people are thinking.
Very good. Okay. Well, that's a very optimistic tone. Actually, that's a great segue to really what I want to spend the rest of the presentation on, which I think for me personally is I love the policy and the operational side of the house. So that's why we're doing this. So could I ask you to put up that third Slido question? The last one was, I'll take the hit for maybe not being worded very well. This one I didn't really tell you this answer because I think there's going to be a split in the view, but please answer. The FAA's Part 135 rules already cover all of the various operations being contemplated under the urban air mobility construct, or the eVTOL construct. Yeah? Okay, well, good. So I would say from my legal perspective, the answer is definitely no. There are some people that kind of think it is, but I would tell you just day-to-day nuts and bolts, there's a big disconnect with a lot of the business proposals I've seen and what the rules currently say. So let me lay the groundwork for that, and then I'll ask some more questions. So again, when we're talking about the operational rules, we're talking about who gets to carry what, when, what kind of requirements do they need to meet, like pilot training requirements and ongoing maintenance requirements, and do they need some type of a license or certification to do that, or can they just go out and do it? I got a little Cessna Cardinal. I'm a pure Part 91. I go jump on my airplane. I say goodbye to the tower, head south. I don't have to talk to the FAA at all. And in the 15 years I've owned my airplane, I think I've talked to the FAA once, right? Conversely, if I'm doing something that the FAA considers to be commercial, which I can tell you is much broader than what most of the people in this room think is commercial, you're going to have to get additional licensure in this airplane or in this size of market. We're talking 135. So baseline, 14 CFR, Part 91, baseline set of rules applies to everybody. It's highly regulated but relatively easy. You do something commercial, you're going to jump to Part 135. Now you need certification and so forth. So part of the purpose of this panel was, I think everybody kind of knows that, but for the people that don't know that there's that dichotomy in those two sets of operating rules and then the analogy that's going to be in place in Europe, what I'd like to do is I'll start with Mike and David and get you to, because I know you guys have been looking at what in this sphere and everybody's welcome to add in on this as we go down the line. In this sphere, what are the really key differences from just a purely logistical standpoint of what do you need to do extra under Part 135 that you don't necessarily need to do 91? Do you have some thoughts on that, Mike?
Yeah, so I'm quite simple. From a Part 91 perspective, you're carrying yourself, you're carrying people from your company, so the expectation is that you're going to take care of yourself and you're going to take care of people from your company, so that's non-commercial, there's a lot less oversight from the FAA. Part 135, you're expected, you're holding out to the public, and the public wouldn't have that expertise, wouldn't necessarily have that trust, so there's going to be a higher level of oversight, and the FAA will ensure that you jump through a lot more hoops. And I think that that's all sensible, it's all reasonable, and maybe David can go into some of the details as to what those hoops would be and how one approaches it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think with 135, I mean, when you hear 135, you just think commercial. And big picture, you just want to groan because there's so many regulations. That's a good thing, right? That's a good thing, but it's all safety and commercial operations. And so, I mean, the level of safety is higher. When I try to think about how this is going to fit in and how this urban air mobility is going to fit into a 135, it's going to be a little different. I don't know if they could certainly stick with 135, and what you typically do is a gap analysis. You look at each specific regulation, there's hundreds of them, and say how this will apply. And that's how, in fact, how Part 107 came to being. They took the exemptions and created 107, and that was, lightning speed. I've never seen a regulation go that quickly from theory to final rule. In fact, the broker charter rule took almost 10 years to do, and that was kind of easy.
Yeah.
135 is going to, it's going to be a lot of, there's going to have to be a gap analysis. You're going to have to look and see and compare each regulation to see how this would fit. And the question becomes, what is urban air mobility? It's a lot different from different types of operations. And the interesting thing, I think we chatted about this before, I think one of the panelists mentioned, the United States is probably not going to be the first country to have all these companies and all these innovations occur. Frankly, I think Africa's doing it right now with Zipline. Great operations in Rwanda. They're doing it in Ghana, and they're delivering blood, medical supplies. There's offshore registries that will register drones right now. I have a client that's flying drones in East Africa. So, if you want to do it next week, pack up and go to Africa and start doing it, because that's an option.
Well, so let's keep going down the line, because, and then trying to transition more to the operator standpoint. And you guys have operated, been involved in operations. What are some of the concrete examples in this space between 135 and 91 that you think may be problematic, or things that have to be addressed, or may need to be tweaked, or if you can think of any? Anyone?
I have a list here.
Why don't you throw some out and we'll let them.
Sure. So who or what is the PIC? What responsibilities can be delegated? How will operations comply with things like minimum altitude rules? What about fuel reserves, which I think was discussed in the panel this morning briefly? And then how does that all get handled? Carl talked about Part 23, which is used to be a prescriptive regulation, and now it's a performance-based regulation. So how will the FAA or EASA or others look at that from an operations perspective?
Yeah, you want to pick up on that? Or you got anything to add to that, or from your perspective?
Sure, yeah. So to address the last bit, for EASA, it's a little bit different because they've just published this SCE VTOL construct.
We'll get Patrick to tell us about that. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
I said we'll get Patrick to tell us about that.
Okay.
Keep going.
Okay,
Keep going.
yeah. But for the U.S., where the momentum is certainly towards leveraging the performance-based reg with the standards are being written right now, and it's not a complete package yet. So this is where I think many of the companies in this space, or many of the startups in this space, it's very wise to look at what standards exist, what are the ones that are most likely to be accepted by the regulator, because it's certainly no guarantee that just because a standard is written that the FAA is going to accept it as a means of compliance. And then what's a reasonable timeline for having a published standard that is acceptable by the regulator for things like batteries and things like that. And to your point about the fuel reserve, that's a key one for many of these all-electric VTOLs. And that's a Part 91 requirement. That's not even in 23. So that's a very interesting question. And I think that, again, talking from the perspective of an industry association, we want to be advising our members to look at, let's try to minimize the number of special requests that you're looking for. If you can meet the operational reserves today, I think you've got a stronger case to set up your operation. If you need some sort of special consideration, that's a more challenging sell. There's a mechanism to do it, like potentially with a SORA or something like that, but it's no guarantees.
More problematic.
Yeah. And the FAA is going to be looking for an equivalent level of safety. So if you can't perform.
It's a tough.
And how far can you prove that? Yeah.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I think ultimately you're looking at it from what are the various points, but we have to see the difference between Part 135 and Part 91 is you have an operator that is legally endorsing the responsibility to fly commercial this aircraft in a safe way, and I think that endorsement, that legal endorsement, that is coming with what we call in Europe the AOC. I think what you call the Part 135.
Yes.
I think the new rules with EASA when it comes to drones has actually also set up a framework for the same for an operator endorsing these rules of safety and compliance. We have now gotten the first air operator certificate for drones in Luxembourg. That's where we're headquartered, and the rules are strict, and it comes down ultimately to protect, in this case, not the people sitting in the drones, but the people on the ground, houses, and if something happens, we are responsible for it, and that's why we follow the rules. And I think that's the main difference between Part 135 and Part 91, who is responsible.
Okay, well, actually, so let me take that and tee up another question for Mike. So to me, one of the most interesting differences between 91 and 135 in the US and in this whole sphere and the DOT rules is the rules don't really contemplate right now the ability to do single seat sales. 135, you charter the basic concept, the way it was written, the way it was conceptualized originally was, you charter the entire aircraft. DOT Economic Authority says if you're selling on a single seat basis, that's either Part 380, that's a public charter, or you go out and get economic authority. You don't get to sell. Neither agency recognizes the ability just to sell a seat. But that's not the Uber Lyft model. And what we're running into, and there are a bunch of companies out there that are doing this that I know the FAA are looking at, is this kind of single seat sales. And when is it when you're really selling a sale? And gosh, is it really just the pilot who's out doing some cost sharing and building time? And where does that fit in? And how are the very successful automobile-based concepts, how is that going to translate into the aviation side of the house from a policy perspective, safety perspective? Can you give me your thoughts on that, Michael?
Yeah, I think as we talk about how safe our aviation system is, we're really talking about airliners. We're talking about the big, the dozen hubs and the secondary cities. We have a very different level of safety when you get to general aviation, and I think that's always been accepted. But these rules, I think there's a heroic effort to try to make them fit the drone technology, Part 135. It was never contemplated the kind of operations that we're looking at. And I think it's more instructive to look at what's happened with automobiles. So with the Uber model, you have a licensed driver. You can decide what level of licensure you want, but you've got a licensed driver, and you've got a vehicle that meets certain standards, and then that licensed driver can operate. In aviation, you can have a commercial pilot, or whatever other add-ons, instrument commercial pilot, who has an aircraft that's maintained to commercial standards and is certificated, but can't sell seats the way an Uber driver does, because you've got this third thing, this Part 135 operator. I'm not sure that makes sense. And if you were to start from scratch, I'm not sure for a four-seater airplane you would put those kind of rules. Is there some reason that you couldn't operate the same way that an Uber automobile operates? And I think that as we go forward, it's fine to try to make these new technologies fit the old rules, but I think we also have to have our eye out for, are there ways we could achieve the same standard of safety or an acceptable standard of safety and sort of free up some businesses to operate and help aviation.
Awesome. Thank you. So, I would say from NBAA's perspective, the same policy concept, because you deal with both sides of that house. Do you have any thoughts on that issue of, are we going to change the rules to allow for single seat sales and modify stuff?
Yeah, so I think there are ways to do single seat sales now through a self-aggregation process, so the operator isn't selling the seats.
Well, that's
So
the question is what's really happening.
Right. Those are kind of workarounds.
That's why I'm saying that's kind of amorphous, yeah.
Yeah, that's not the way
Yeah.
would be ideal. Ideally, you would have something that says, okay, this is the process you would go through to allow single seat sales. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. I think that from an FAA perspective, they've been encouraging cargo drone operations through exemptions largely from the types of operating rules we've been talking about. And I think Alphabet and Amazon both have gotten exemptions to do operations, and that's going to prove some of this stuff. Once you start carrying people, that's a whole different sphere altogether. And I think we're going to have to see some rule changes in order to make this a very efficient marketplace in the United States. I don't think we can completely bend the Part 135 regulations, the DOT Economic Authority regulations. I think that there's going to have to be something. The challenge is, where is that in the prioritization? And not to skip too far ahead in your outline that you helpfully sent to us, but a question that you're going to ask later is congressional authority something that's required? And I'm going to answer that now. And I think Congress might have to get involved only to provide the mandate, the prioritization, and then the resources in order for things to move through the very intentionally slow and intentionally methodical rulemaking process.
Well, so actually, that's fine, because that's a good segue to that. That's a really big question is, and especially with some of the experience we have here both in Europe and then within the FAA is, what are the pluses and minuses of bringing this to Congress, kind of jumping over the regulator's head to the legislative body? What have been the experiences in that area? Do we want to poke the hornet's nest, or are we going to have to poke the hornet's nest? Mike, what do you want?
Well, almost always a bad idea, I would say. Sometimes a necessary idea, but I think the best example of that is the 1,500-hour rule. I mean, part of the pilot shortage is created by this 1,500-hour rule. That was driven by Congress. That was not an FAA initiative. Congress passed a law in response to the Colgan accident in 2009 to mandate that every airline pilot have at least 1,500 hours. Both pilots in that crash had well more than 1,500 hours, so I'm not sure how that would have solved that, but that's how Congress works sometimes. And now you have, because it's in law, and because of the occasional lack of courageousness of Congress, that law is never going to change, I would say. So we're stuck with it. And so that's the risk when you go to Congress for a solution. I think, having said that, if you formulate a policy and you have a direction and you give Congress a way of nudging things in the right direction without tying your hands too much, it can be quite helpful. And I suspect we'll have to get to that point at some point.
And let me also add, so going to Congress really isn't, so sure you go to Congress, but it doesn't mean the agencies are going to listen to whatever Congress tells you. I mean, Colgan was a bit different because of an accident. I think the FAA is much more reactionary. But, again, the agencies move at their own speed, unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess. And so I think that's the thing to keep in mind is that, and it's not just the FAA, again, it's the FCC. Once you put all these things in the air, how are you going to communicate with them? And the remote ID is one thing that I think is very promising. It's going to happen, and I said it's going to happen outside the U.S. first, but I really think it's going to happen here. But it's not going to be on the grand scale that everyone thinks, and then certainly by 2023.
Yeah, so not that I'm advocating that we all run and storm Capitol Hill on this issue. I think that a lot of work can be done with the agencies. For me, it's an issue of prioritization. You mentioned before the broker rule that DOT promulgated, which took over 10 years. And that's something that I was very involved with back when I did a lot of policy work for NBAA. And it's just the DOT did not have the resources to spend on it.
Focus on it.
The advantage of going to Capitol Hill is that Capitol Hill, when they write legislation, can put some time frames in. The Part 135 flight duty rest rules is a good example of that, where within 24 months, the FAA has to have a report back to Congress on the status of the rulemaking. So things can go a little bit faster when Congress allows that prioritization to happen within the federal agencies. So that would be the advantage.
And that's a good point. I think so. If it's not just Congress too. So with the broker charter rule, there's one aspect of it, the last aspect of the broker charter rule, that's another opportunity for folks to take. So if there's this law out there called the Administrative Procedure Act, and so if the FAA or any agency for that matter rules against you or unfavorably for something, you have the right to challenge them if the basis for their decision is arbitrary and capricious. And so that's one opportunity. If you go and say, look, I want to do this, I'm just as safe as 135, and they say, no, you're not, then you can proceed against them under the Administrative Procedure Act. And that's how we, in the broker charter rule, got some relief and actually won with respect to government contracts in the context of broker charter rule. But there's a lot of opportunities out there, but you just have to think with an open mind. But you're certainly not going to be able to go in and say, hey, I'm a 135 operator with this, eVTOL device. They're going to look at you like, they can spell eVTOL, but that's about it,
Patrick, yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I don't have much to say about the Congress of the United States, I assume they also as elected as the people in Europe, and that makes me doubt some of their competencies when it comes to aviation safety. And again, I don't know about the Congress in the United States. I watch fake news, but at the end of the day, if I had a choice, I would rather have the experts of the FAA or of the EASA rule and make the rules when it comes to safety, and not anybody with some kind of a lobbying agenda behind it, ruling on safety, because that's what it comes down to. Too often we are forgetting that it's all about safety in this industry.
Very good, thank you. Carl, do you have anything you want to add to that, or shall I go to my last question? Okay, so the last question is just from your perspective, as you're out in the industry talking to people, what's the thing that you're seeing that the regulators are the most worried about that as you interface? Why don't we just work, if you can answer that, what's worked on? Yeah, as you're working with regulators, what are you hearing as the biggest worry?
So in our experience, the folks inside, like Small Aircraft Directorate, are very, very open to applicants coming in with a rational proposal for a certification basis, a means of compliance, and that sort of thing. The challenge that we have right now is that, because especially with the new Part 23, there is a window of opportunity to be a little bit more flexible. The challenge is the standards are not fully vetted yet. So I think in my conversations with folks inside the FAA, they would like to see some initial efforts by small ventures, low risk things where they can start to get a level of comfort with some of these new technologies. We've got a lot of very experienced players that are coming in with level 4 air taxi certification projects that are complicated and that involve multiple components that are new, that haven't been done before. And it's a lot easier for any organization to deal with kind of one bit at a time. And so if there can be prioritization, clear prioritization and focus, it can accelerate the process. And I think that that's something that I hope many of these companies will
Excellent.
Try to keep in mind.
Very good point. Patrick, what do you think is the single issue, if you're hearing anything that's the most worrisome to the regulators you have to deal with? Is there one?
I think so safety, that is of course the main point, but interesting enough, Europe, contrary to what I heard today here, is also more focused on environmental protection, and that means CO2 and noise. I think today here, I only heard about noise. I think within EASA, I heard a lot about environmental protection, CO2.
Very good, excellent. Michael?
Yeah, I would just answer that by saying I think what really works with FAA is for the Silicon Valley folks who show up is to show the aviation pedigree. So the companies that have aviators in them or are run by aviators understand the language. FAA becomes much more comfortable. If you know what a safety management system is, you get almost an audible sigh of relief that you understand the language, and that tends, I think, to help facilitate the conversations.
David,
I think
one
the
issue?
FAA does well with familiarity. And so if you look at what happened with 107 and the exemption process, take something that's already off the shelf and try to conform it to what you want. Make it simple, make it easy to understand, and just do it that way because, again, safety's paramount. You got to make sure that safety's there and then follow what's already been done. It's the easiest way to do it.
Very good. Can you think of one issue?
Noise complaints.
Noise complaints, okay, very good. Very good. So I've been watching the really good questions down here. Two of them I noted. One asked, why is the FAA not cracking down? I will tell you, I've been very involved in some illegal charter panels. NATA has been very active in that, other associations. And so they actually are cracking down, and there's some big penalties, and there are others on the way. The second one was, is world peace going to happen? Boy, I wish I knew the answer to that. I don't know. Any other closing comments from anybody? We have 8 seconds left.
It's an exciting time to be in aviation.
Yeah, it is. I think that's it. Look at that, 0 right there, time's up. Thank you all very much for listening.